The gavel slammed down on the edge of an old grain crate, the sound cracking through the makeshift courtroom like a gunshot. It was a barn, not a courthouse, and the air smelled of hay dust and nervous sweat. Not justice. Enough! Judge Winslow's voice was a low bark, frayed at the edges. He was a man drowning in a suit too formal for the setting, his collar already dark with perspiration despite the cold draft that snaked through the warped planks of the wall. He glared at the two men standing before him. One more word out of either of you without a shred of proof, and I'll toss this entire ridiculous case out, and the lot of you with it. Elijah Bickner just smirked. His mustache, waxed into two perfect points, seemed to smirk with him. He was a man built of soft flesh and hard greed, his dark suit straining at the buttons over his round belly. He leaned forward, his voice oily and loud, meant for the whole room to hear. "I have my proof, Your Honor." He held up a creased map, the boundary lines smeared as if drawn in anger. He pointed a fat finger at a jagged red line. "My land survey, clear as day. This man's fence," he jabbed the finger toward the other side of the aisle, "cuts 20 feet into my property, 20 feet of prime river frontage." He let the words hang in the air. "That's theft, plain and simple." Across the aisle, Colton Hayes said nothing. He didn't have to. The whole town of Las Pedras knew who he was, the largest rancher in the Southern Valley, a man whose wealth was counted in cattle and whose words were counted in shillings. He was land quiet, a man who spoke more with his eyes than his mouth. He just sat there, arms folded over his chest, his flat-brimmed hat resting on his knee. His eyes, the color of freshly turned earth, scanned the room slowly, taking in every whisper, every shifting foot. He looked like he'd seen this all before, a cheap drama played out by lesser men. But this time was different. This time, the accusations were sticking. Bickner had a loud voice, a polished map, and a crowd of townsfolk hungry for a scandal. All Colton had was his silence and the heavy weight of a reputation that made some people uncomfortable. He was too quiet, too private, and far, far too rich for their liking. And in the back of the barn, hidden in the shadows, a woman watched it all unfold. She watched it like a slow-burning house fire, the kind you can't possibly stop, the kind you can only bear witness to. Her name was Iris Bell, and she was a ghost. Her coat was frayed at the sleeves, the stitches at the hem coming loose. The scarf around her neck was knotted twice, a desperate attempt to hide the places where the wool had worn thin. For the past 2 nights, she had slept in a collapsed lean-to just outside of town, close to the Pecos River. Close enough to hear the coyotes howl their lonely songs, close enough to hear the sharp, splintering crack of stolen fence posts being pulled from the earth in the dead of night. Now she sat with her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap, her jaw set so hard it ached. There was a voice in her head, a voice that had been her only companion for years, and it was screaming at her, "Stay quiet, stay small, stay invisible." But for the first time, another voice was rising, trembling beneath her ribs, demanding to be heard. The judge leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh that seemed to drain the last bit of patience from his body. "Mr. Hayes, if you have no evidence to contest this claim—" Colton didn't move. His silence was his answer. The judge raised his gavel. "Then I have no choice but to—" "I do." The words were quiet, but they cut through the tension in the barn like a knife. Every single head turned. Bickner's, the judge's, even Colton Hayes's. Iris Bell was on her feet. She stepped forward, moving through the narrow aisle, her worn boots scuffing against the dirt-covered floorboards. Someone in the second row leaned over and murmured, loud enough for her to hear, "Who in the hell is that?" She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge. "I'm no one important," Iris said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "But I saw what happened." Judge Winslow squinted down at her, his eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. "Your name, woman?" "Iris Bell." "You from around here, Miss Bell?" "No, sir. Just passing through." She took another step forward, her gaze unflinching. But I was camped by the river 2 nights ago. I'm a light sleeper. She paused, letting the room hang on her next words. I heard movement around midnight. I looked out from my shelter, and I saw 3 men. They were pulling up old fence posts on Mr. Hayes's side of the line and replanting them deeper into his pasture. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Bickner's mouth opened, a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Iris didn't stop. The words came faster now, a flood she could no longer hold back. One of them had a limp, favored his right foot. I saw them carry in new posts, already cut to size. They hammered them in fast, working in the dark. She looked directly at Bickner, whose face was rapidly losing its color. They had a lantern with them. The glass was cracked. I remember because one of them dropped it, and I heard the rattle of the broken glass hitting the ground. Someone in the back whistled low under their breath. The barn had gone dead still. The only sound was the wind whining through the cracks in the walls. They weren't trying to be quiet, Iris continued, her voice ringing with a certainty that could not be faked. They just thought no one was out there. They just thought no one was watching. Judge Winslow slowly turned his heavy gaze from Iris to Elijah Bickner. The man had gone pale, a sickly white beneath his sun-reddened cheeks. "Mr. Bickner," the judge said, his voice like stones grinding together, "do you have any witnesses to your side of this story?" Bickner fumbled with his crumpled map, his hands shaking. "My men, they're traveling. On business." From a corner near the door, a tall ranch hand with crossed arms let out a short, derisive laugh. "I bet they are." The judge stood up, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He looked at Bickner with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Case dismissed," he boomed, the words echoing off the rafters. "Mr. Hayes retains his land. And Mr. Bickner," he leaned forward, pointing a warning finger, "if I hear so much as a whisper of this nonsense again, I will have you held for fraud. Do you understand me?" Bickner, deflated and gray, could only nod. Colton Hayes rose slowly from his seat. He picked up his hat, dusted it off on his thigh, and settled it on his head. Then he turned, and his eyes found Iris in the crowd. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was more like recognition. Like he saw something in her he wasn't expecting to find. Something he'd forgotten even existed. Outside, the townsfolk spilled into the stark midday sun, buzzing like flies over the morning's drama. The scandal they had hoped for had been delivered, just not in the way they'd expected. Iris moved with the crowd, her head down, her plan simple. Disappear. Melt back into the shadows before the questions started, before anyone could ask who she was, where she came from, why she was there. But a shadow fell across her path, blocking the sun. She looked up. It was Colton Hayes. He stood there with a kind of quiet gravity, his coat hanging open, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-browned forearms. The dust on his boots looked like it had been there for a lifetime. He wasn't a man who belonged in a courtroom, even a makeshift one. He belonged to the land. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. She raised her chin, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I didn't do it for you." For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. A flicker of something real in that stoic face. "You got a place to stay?" he asked. She hesitated. The easy answer, the safe answer, was yes. The lean-to by the river was still there, a pathetic shelter of wind-flapped canvas and broken branches. But it was hers. It was anonymous. But something in his voice, something unforced and direct, made her answer differently. Made her speak a truth she hadn't intended to? Not exactly. "My ranch is 3 miles east of here," he said, as if stating a simple fact. "Warm food, a dry roof. You're welcome to rest there for the night." Her eyes narrowed. Suspicion, her oldest and most trusted friend. I'm not looking for favors. Didn't say it was one. He held her gaze, his eyes unblinking. Just figured anyone brave enough to stand up for the truth might want a meal she didn't have to fight a coyote for. Iris studied him. She searched his face for any sign of pity, any hint of expectation. There was none. He didn't look like a man who was offering charity. He looked like a man who had seen his share of lies and betrayal and simply didn't want to see one more go unanswered. He looked tired of the world's ugliness. She gave a short, sharp nod, the kind of nod that concedes a point but gives nothing else away. All right, she said. One night. He stepped aside, a small gesture of respect, letting her pass him first. He didn't walk behind her, like a man following. He didn't walk in front, like a man leading. He fell into step right beside her. He matched her stride. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, Iris didn't feel like she was being followed or chased. She didn't feel forgotten or invisible. She felt seen. And that feeling, more than the promise of a warm meal, was the most terrifying thing of all. The Hayes Ranch wasn't a grand estate. It sat low in the hills, a collection of sturdy, weathered buildings framed by scrub oak and the faint silver shimmer of the river that wound its way behind the back pasture. It looked less like it was built on the land and more like it had grown out of it. As they rode up in his wagon, the sun had begun its slow dip toward the horizon, pulling the shadows long and thin across the dirt path. Iris kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but her stomach was a tight, cold coil of nerves. This was a mistake. She was a ghost, a whisper. Ghosts didn't sit in the open daylight next to men like Colton Hayes. They didn't go to ranches. They stayed in the shadows, where they belonged. Colton hadn't spoken much on the ride. He pointed out a few landmarks, a crooked mesa, a dry creek bed, and noted how a cold front was rolling in from the northwest. She didn't mind the silence. It gave her room to breathe, to wrestle with the panic that was clawing at her throat. This was a mistake. One night, then she would be gone before the sun was fully up. When they reached the front yard, a woman stepped out onto the wide porch, wiping her hands on a dishcloth tucked into her apron. She was middle-aged, built solid and sturdy like the ranch itself, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Rosa!" Colton called out as he pulled the reins and hopped down from the wagon. "We've got company for the night." Rosa's gaze fell on Iris. It was a swift, calculating look, taking in the frayed coat, the worn boots, the defiant set of her jaw. She didn't speak right away. She just watched, and her silence said more than a dozen questions ever could. It said, "Who are you? What trouble are you bringing to this house?" "I'll fix an extra plate," she said finally, her voice flat and neutral, before turning and disappearing back inside the house. Iris climbed down from the wagon on her own, brushing the trail dust from her coat. Colton walked ahead, unlocking the heavy front door with a key that made a single, solid jingle in the quiet air. He didn't offer to carry her small, battered bag, and she was grateful for it. It was a kind of respect, an acknowledgement that she could carry her own burdens. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something delicious stewing on the stove. Meat, carrots, maybe rosemary. The floors were scrubbed clean but uneven from age and the weight of countless footsteps. A single oil lamp burned with a low, steady flame in the front room, casting a warm, golden glow on the simple, sturdy furniture. "You'll stay in the side room," Colton said, nodding down a short hallway. "The bed's clean. No one's used it since my brother passed." She paused, the words catching her off guard. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He seemed to understand. "You can rest up, stay the night, and be on your way in the morning. No questions asked." He paused, his gaze steady. "But if you'd rather earn your keep, there's always work that needs doing." "I'd rather work," she said, the words coming out faster and more forcefully than she intended. Work was safe. Work had a beginning and an end. Work kept your hands busy and your mind from wandering into dark corners. He nodded once, as if that was the answer he'd expected. Good. After supper, we'll see about that. They ate at a wide kitchen table under the steady, humming silence of the evening. Rosa moved around the kitchen with an efficient grace, but Iris could feel the woman's eyes on her now and then. It was the way a woman watches another woman, trying to decide if she is a threat, a rival, or just a lost soul passing through. After the meal, Colton led her to a small room at the back of the house. It had clearly been used for storage. Old saddles and dusty oil lamps lined one wall, but against the far wall was a narrow bed, neatly made with a thick woolen blanket, and a small stool stood by the window. Iris ran her hand along the blanket. The cotton was clean and smelled faintly of lavender. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept on something that didn't rustle and shift under her back with every breath. The window faced east, toward the rising sun. In the darkness, the river was only a soft, rushing sound, a hush that might lull a person to sleep, if their heart wasn't beating like a war drum in their chest. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before she even thought about sleep. She didn't think about Bickner or the trial. She didn't even think about Colton Hayes and his quiet, unnerving way of looking at her, like he saw something useful in the wreckage. She thought of her name, Iris Bell. It wasn't her real name. It was a name she had chosen for its simplicity, for its lack of history, chosen because the name Morgan was too heavy a stone to carry. It was a name that had belonged to a dead woman, a woman she had tried to bury. She hadn't told Colton that. He hadn't asked. But as she lay down in the strange, quiet room, she knew with a chilling certainty that secrets, like ghosts, never stayed buried for long. The next morning came cold and brilliantly clear. A delicate layer of frost silvered the fence posts and curled the edges of the fallen autumn leaves. It was the kind of cold that felt clean, that promised a new start. Iris rose before the first hint of dawn, pinning her hair back and rolling up her sleeves. She was not a guest. She was a worker. There was a difference. A very important difference. She met a man by the barn just as the sky was turning from gray to pale blue. He was tall and lean, with a pronounced limp and the kind of permanent squint that comes from staring into the sun for too many years. "Boss says you're looking for work," he said, his voice a low grumble. "I am." He gestured with his thumb toward two sorrel horses tied by the trough. "Name's Jed. You know anything about horses?" She walked past him, picking up a curry comb from a hook on the wall. "I was a field nurse during the war," she answered, not looking at him. "I know pain, and I know when a living creature is pretending not to have it." Jed blinked once, taken aback by her bluntness. Then a dry, rasping sound that might have been a laugh escaped his throat. "Fine. Just don't get yourself kicked." She didn't. In fact, by mid-morning, she had calmed the older gelding, a notoriously ill-tempered animal, enough to clean out his left rear hoof. She found a small, sharp stone lodged near the frog, the source of an irritation that had been plaguing him for weeks. She worked with a gentle, confident touch that the animal seemed to understand. Jed watched the whole thing from his perch on the fence, his arms crossed over his chest, saying nothing. But his squint seemed a little less harsh. Later, she moved to the tack room, a cluttered space filled with moldy old ledgers and dust-covered tools. Without being asked, she began to organize it, moving through the mess with a quiet efficiency that was almost startling. Rosa poked her head in around noon, ostensibly looking for a misplaced bridle. She stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the neat stacks of leather and the swept floor. "This room's looked like a coyote den since March," she muttered, half to herself, half to Iris. "I like things to have a place," Iris said simply, not looking up from the record book she was dusting off. Rosa didn't respond, but a few minutes later she returned and left a mason jar full of glistening preserved peaches on the counter before walking away without another word. It was a peace offering, an acknowledgement. That evening, Colton returned from the north pasture, his boots caked with mud and his shirt streaked with dust. He found Iris in the small back garden, methodically clipping the wilted dead sprigs from the herb rose bushes. "Those plants haven't bloomed since June," he said, his voice startling her. He had a way of moving without making a sound. "They'll come back," she replied, her focus still on her task. "They just need a little space to breathe." He didn't ask what she meant by that. He just stood there, in that way he had, quiet and steady, giving her enough room to choose the distance between them. "Jed says you work steady all day," he said after a moment. "I like to be useful." He nodded once. "You ever handle a set of books before?" A shadow passed over her face, so fleeting he might have missed it if he wasn't watching her so closely. "I was married to a man who kept books," she said carefully, the words chosen like stones being placed across a treacherous river. "I know enough to see the lies hidden in the ledgers." He caught the bitter edge in her voice, the hint of a story buried deep, but he didn't press. He wasn't a man who pried. "Tomorrow," he said instead, "I'll show you the storeroom logs. Maybe you can make some sense of them. No one else has been able to." "Thank you," she said. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the evening wind. "I'm not offering you charity, Iris," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "I'm offering you a place where hard work still counts for something, where a person's past doesn't have to be their future." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and she saw past the quiet rancher, past the silent landowner. She saw a man who understood what it meant to be judged, what it meant to be alone. "I wouldn't have stayed if I thought it was anything else," she said. He gave her another one of his small, almost smiles, and then turned and walked back toward the house. That night, Iris lay in her narrow bed with the window cracked open, letting the cold, clean air wash over her. For the first time in a long, long time, she didn't dream of her husband, Caleb. She didn't dream of jail cells or accusing eyes. She dreamed of lavender fields she had never seen, and of large, calloused, careful hands offering her a clean slate. A new page, and for the first time in a long, long time, Iris Bell let herself want to stay. But as she drifted off to sleep, a new cold fear slithered into her heart. What if this place, this peace, wasn't real? What if it was just another beautiful lie, waiting to be shattered? The days at the Hayes Ranch fell into a rhythm, steady and quiet as a heartbeat. The weeks passed, turning from late autumn into the sharp, brittle beginning of winter. For Iris, it was a rhythm she hadn't known she was starving for until it was all around her. Mornings began with the sound of Colton's boots on the old wood floors, the smell of coffee percolating in the big tin pot, and the soft, rhythmic thud of feed buckets being filled. She started rising before the sun, often even before Rosa. After a week of finding the water already boiling when she came into the kitchen, Rosa finally gave up trying to pretend she didn't appreciate it. Iris found a strange kind of peace in the patterns, in the endless cycle of chores. The barn smelled of clean hay and saddle oil, not the sweat and secrecy of her past. The pantry needed sorting. The herb beds needed to be covered for the winter. The fence by the creek needed mending. Everything had its place. And slowly, she was starting to feel like she had a place too. Colton remained a quiet presence, a steady shadow at the edge of her days. He would pass by the stable at noon and give her a nod. He would check in before supper with a quiet, "Everything good?" His words were few, but they were solid. They were dependable. And somehow, without him even trying, he was making her feel like she belonged there. It was Jed, the gruff, limping ranch hand, who started to warm up to her first. One afternoon, while she was wrapping an old mule's swollen leg in a warm compress of calendula and clove, he leaned on the stall door beside her. "You ever think of staying on longer?" he asked, his voice still a grumble, but without the hard edge it had held before. "I haven't thought much beyond today," she said honestly, focusing on tying the bandage just right. Well, he said, shifting his weight. Rosa says the potatoes in the root cellar are lasting longer since you started sorting them, and the damn roses you fussed over are still holding on, even with the frost. I added crushed eggshells and a few prayers, she said, a dry hint of humor in her tone. Jed actually snorted, a real laugh this time. Hell, woman. Maybe the Lord's finally started listening to someone around here. That evening, when Iris went to her room, she found a neatly folded apron lying on her bed. It was simple, made of sturdy blue cotton. Stitched into the hem in small, careful letters were her initials. IB. There was no note, no explanation, just a quiet, solid gesture of acceptance from Rosa. By the end of the second month, something shifted. Colton asked her to ride the boundary lines with him on the east side of the property, the side that bordered Bickner's land. It was the first time they had been truly alone together for more than a few minutes. They rode in silence for the first half hour, their horses picking their way carefully along a high, windy ridge. Below them, the land rolled out in vast golden waves, crisp and beautiful in the winter sun. I used to think this place was too big for one man, Colton said suddenly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Iris waited, knowing there was more. And now? She asked softly. He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and serious. Now I think it's too big for one man who doesn't know how to let anyone in. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just held his gaze. For the first time, she didn't look away. They stopped near a fallen cottonwood tree, where a corner fence post had come loose from the frozen ground. Colton dismounted to inspect the taut wire. Iris slid off her horse and followed, kneeling in the dry grass beside him. She watched his hands, strong and capable, as he worked to tighten the wire. Suddenly, his hand slipped. The sharp end of the wire tore a jagged, angry line across his palm. "Damn it!" he hissed, shaking his hand, sending droplets of dark red blood spattering onto the dirt. Before he could even curse again, Iris was already digging into her saddlebag. She moved with a speed and purpose that surprised him. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice calm and firm. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he did as he was told, sitting on the fallen log. She pulled a small leather pouch from her bag, and from it, a clean cloth and a small glass vial filled with a dark liquid. He winced as she gently took his hand and poured the calendula tincture over the wound. "You've done this before," he muttered, watching her work. She wrapped the cloth tightly around his hand, tying it off with a neat, efficient knot. "Too many times," she said, her voice distant. "Were you a soldier?" he asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of his reserve. She paused, her hand still resting on his. "A nurse," she said quietly. "Civil War. Union side." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not like a man sizing up a stranger he'd hired, but like someone suddenly seeing the hidden corners of another person's life, corners that had been kept in darkness. He saw the ghosts in her eyes. "I didn't know that," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You didn't ask," she replied simply. They rode back to the ranch in silence. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who no longer need to fill the empty spaces with words to feel understood. A silence built on shared wounds. That night, Iris lay in bed, tracing the pattern of the frost on her window pane. She thought about Colton's hand in hers, about the sudden, startling intimacy of that moment. She was letting her guard down. She was starting to feel something, and that was dangerous. That was how the last man had destroyed her. She got up and pulled a single, folded letter from the very bottom of her satchel. It was a letter she had started writing weeks ago, a confession of everything. Everything about Caleb Morgan, the charming man she had married, the forged loans, the public humiliation, the name she had been forced to abandon. Her fingers trembled as she held it. She should burn it. She should destroy the last physical proof of that life, of that woman. But she couldn't. Instead, She found a loose floorboard beneath her window, pried it up, and tucked the letter into the dark, dusty space below, just in case. She wasn't ready to hand her past over to anyone, not even to Colton Hayes. Not yet. The past was a monster, and she was terrified that if she let it out of its cage, it would devour them both. A week later, on a Sunday afternoon, Rosa started bringing out the good dishes for supper. Not the everyday chipped stoneware, but the delicate hand-painted porcelain that was usually reserved for Christmas. Iris raised an eyebrow. "Are we expecting the governor?" Rosa just smirked, a knowing little smile playing on her lips. "There's a town dance next week. He's going to ask you." Iris blinked, her heart giving a sudden, sharp lurch. "Colton? You think he's been out there sanding down that porch railing every morning for the past 3 days because it actually needs it?" Rosa chuckled. "Man hasn't noticed that railing in 10 years. Iris laughed, a real, genuine laugh. It felt strange in her own throat. No one had teased her like that in that easy, familiar way in years. But beneath the warmth of the moment, a cold knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. A town dance, a public place, full of strangers, full of eyes, full of people who might recognize a ghost. The morning of the dance, Colton found her in the barn, brushing down the mare until its coat shone like polished copper. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Iris," he began. "You don't have to," she said quickly, cutting him off before he could get the words out. She kept her back to him, her hands busy with the brush. "Don't have to what? Ask me." He was silent for a beat. Then he said, his voice flat and serious, "I wasn't going to. I was going to tell you to wear boots that don't give you blisters. The floorboards in that hall are uneven." She stopped brushing and slowly turned to face him. He was leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable, but for the ghost of a smile in his eyes. He was as serious as a bullet. She didn't smile back, but she didn't say no either. That evening, when she went to her room, she found a dress laid out on her bed, folded carefully in rustling tissue paper. It was made of soft blue cotton, simple and elegant, with a clean neckline and long sleeves. Rosa appeared in the doorway behind her. "I sewed that for my niece a few years back," she said quietly, "but she went and married some banker from Amarillo and left it behind. It's yours now if you want it." Iris reached out and touched the soft fabric. "I don't know if I'm the kind of woman who wears a dress like this anymore," she whispered. "You're the kind of woman who's still standing after everything," Rosa said, her voice firm. "That's more than enough." As the sun began to bleed across the western hills, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, Colton waited by the wagon. He wore a freshly brushed coat and a crisp white shirt that somehow made his shoulders look even broader. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. Iris looked at his hand, then at his face. This was it. This was the moment she stepped out of the shadows. She took his hand. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let someone lead her toward a place full of light and music and strangers. And even though a knot of pure, cold dread was twisting in her chest, a warning voice screaming at her to run, she stepped up into that wagon. She was stepping into the beginning of something, and she was terrified it might just be worth staying for. The dance hall in Las Pedras was a river of noise and light. The rafters creaked with the rhythm of 100 stomping feet. The floorboards gave just enough to keep time with the lively fiddle music, and the air was thick with the scent of pine wood, sweat, and cheap perfume. Iris stepped through the wide double doors on Colton's arm, her chin held high, trying to project a confidence she was far from feeling. The simple blue dress felt like a costume, and her own skin felt like a disguise. She wasn't used to being looked at anymore. Not by this many people. There were too many eyes, all of them too curious, too quick to pass judgment. A wave of whispers stirred the moment they entered. She could feel them, like a change in the air pressure. Some of the older ranchers nodded politely at Colton, their eyes flicking to her with open curiosity. Others, mostly the women, glanced at her with sharp, sideways looks before leaning in to whisper into the nearest ear, their hands held up like fans to hide their words. Iris tried to ignore them. She focused on her breathing, on the solid feel of Colton's arm linked with hers. He said nothing, but his presence was a shield. He moved through the crowd with a quiet authority that parted the sea of bodies before them. He greeted Judge Winslow with a respectful tip of his hat, then led her toward a corner near the bandstand, away from the worst of the swirling gossip. They stood there for a few minutes in a comfortable silence, just watching the slow swirl of dancers on the floor. "Regret coming?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. She took a deep breath. "Not yet." He gave her that look again, the one that wasn't quite a smile but hovered close to it. Then, without any more ceremony, he held out his hand. "Do you dance?" "I remember how," she said. He led her onto the floor just as the band struck up a slow waltz. The music was simple, a sweet, plaintive melody that seemed to fill up all the empty spaces inside her. She focused on the feel of his calloused palm against hers, warm, steady, and deeply respectful. His other hand rested gently at the small of her back, a touch so light it was barely there, but it anchored her, kept her from floating away on the tide of her own anxiety. For a moment, just a moment, the edges of the room blurred. The whispers faded, the staring eyes disappeared. It was just the two of them, moving together as if they'd been doing it their whole lives. She forgot where she was. She forgot who she was supposed to be. And then she saw her. Vivian Ashford. She stood near the punch bowl, a queen holding court. Vivian hadn't changed a bit since Iris had last seen her in town weeks ago. Her dress, a garish shade of crimson, clung a little too tightly for modesty. Her laughter was a little too loud. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a wildflower, striking to look at, but with shallow roots, ready to be plucked by the next passerby. Vivian's sharp eyes caught sight of them. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She set down her glass of lemonade and crossed the dance floor with a series of deliberate, calculated steps, her hips swaying. She was a woman on a mission. "Colton Hayes," she cooed, her voice dripping with a poisonous sweetness. "Fancy seeing you out of your cave." "And who," she paused, letting her gaze rake over Iris from head to toe, "is this?" Colton's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained impassive. "Vivian." Vivian ignored him, her focus entirely on Iris. She tilted her head, a gesture that was meant to look curious but came across as condescending. "You must be new in town, or just passing through." Iris offered a faint, polite smile. "Just dancing." "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," Vivian said, not meaning it at all. "It's just, well, we were all so surprised when we heard Colton had started bringing a woman around again. You know, after what happened last time." She let the words hang in the air, a deliberate, venomous insinuation. "You know how folks talk." Colton's jaw tightened, a muscle flexed in his cheek. He was about to speak, but Iris answered first. Her voice was gentle, but there was a core of steel beneath it. "Folks will always talk, ma'am," she said. "It doesn't mean they're worth listening to." Vivian blinked, her perfect smile faltering for just a second. Her lips tightened into a thin line. She had expected a fight, or at least a flustered response. She hadn't expected calm, unshakable grace. "Well," she sniffed, recovering quickly. "Enjoy your evening, then." She turned and swept away, leaving a faint trail of cloying perfume in her wake. As she disappeared into the crowd, Colton looked down at Iris, and his eyes were full of something she had never seen before. It was raw, undisguised admiration. "You handled that better than I would have," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "She's not my problem," Iris said, but her heart was hammering against her ribs, and not from the dancing. She had felt the malice in Vivian's words, seen the possessiveness in her eyes. Something was shifting in the quiet world she had started to build, and she didn't know yet if that shift was a tremor before an earthquake, or the first sign of a foundation finally settling into place. They stayed until the last reel was played. Colton drove her home under a thick blanket of stars, the road silent except for the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant, lonely call of a nighthawk. "Is she always like that?" Iris asked softly into the darkness. "Vivian?" He let out a short, humorless breath. "She hates not knowing what other people are thinking. It drives her mad. She'll hate me then." He glanced over at her, his profile outlined by the faint moonlight. "I don't think you care if she does." "I don't," she admitted, "but it will cause problems for you." "We've had worse," he said simply. She turned her face to the wind, letting the cold air cool the sudden flush in her cheeks. But something about the way he had said "we," not "I," but "we," left a lingering warmth in her chest that stayed with her all the way home. The next morning, the ranch moved with its usual rhythm. Horses to feed, gates to mend, the endless list of chores that kept the world turning. But by noon, news from the dance had traveled as fast as a prairie fire. Jed passed her near the barn, a rare, sideways smirk on his face. "Heard you made quite the impression on Vivian Ashford last night." "I wasn't trying to." "That's probably why it worked," he chuckled. Later, as she was sweeping the front porch, a rider approached the house. He was a slim man on a tired-looking horse, his coat dusty, and his black hat pulled low over his eyes. He dismounted before he reached the steps and slowly pushed the brim of his hat back. Iris. Her heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. The broom slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the wooden planks. It was Caleb Morgan. He was older now, thinner. There were new lines around his eyes, lines of desperation and failure. But the voice was the same. Silk wrapped around a shard of broken glass. Just then, Colton came out from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His eyes went from Iris's pale, stricken face to the stranger standing in his yard. Caleb turned toward him, his posture shifting, a practiced, charming smile instantly appearing on his face. "You must be Mr. Hayes. I've heard a lot about you." "I can't say the same," Colton replied, his voice flat and cold. His gaze was steady, watchful. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew this man was the source of the ghosts in Iris's eyes. Caleb's eyes flicked back to Iris. "Could we talk for a moment? Alone?" She felt rooted to the spot, her feet like lead weights on the porch floor. The past she had run from for so long had finally caught up. It was standing in her sanctuary. She managed a single stiff nod and stepped down from the porch. They walked to the edge of the yard, near the old cottonwood tree. She made sure to keep a careful distance between them. "What do you want, Caleb?" she asked, her voice tight and brittle. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind of gesture that used to charm her and now just made her stomach turn. "To talk. To explain." "There's nothing left to explain. You stole my name. You stole my life. You left me to rot in a jail cell." "And you survived," he said, a hint of genuine, twisted admiration in his voice. "I always knew you would. You're a survivor, Iris." "Don't flatter me," she snapped. "Just say what you came here to say and then get off this land." He looked back toward the house, toward the solid, silent figure of Colton Hayes watching them from the porch. "You're staying here. With him. That's bold, especially after what people might say, if they knew the truth." Her eyes flashed with a fire he hadn't seen in years. "Is that a threat?" "A reminder," he said smoothly. "This cozy little story you're building for yourself here, it's a house of cards. It wouldn't take much to blow it all down." One little whisper of the name Iris Morgan in the right ear. She didn't flinch. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I'm not that woman anymore." "You think he'll see it that way?" he sneered, nodding toward Colton. "You think this stoic, respectable rancher wants a woman with a past like yours?" She turned her back on him, starting to walk away. She wouldn't listen to this. She wouldn't. "People forgive men like me," he called after her, his voice rising, losing its silky edge and becoming sharp and desperate. They expect it. But a woman with a stain on her name? They remember that forever, Iris. Forever. She didn't answer. She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her back straight, her head high. But her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists to stop them. That night, she sat by her window, watching the cold, indifferent moon rise over the hills. She pulled the loose floorboard up and took out the folded letter, her confession. She held it in her trembling hand, wondering how long a ghost could stay buried before it clawed its way out of the grave and dragged everyone down with it. Iris rose before the sun, the ghost of sleep having eluded her all night. Caleb's words echoed in her mind, a poisonous refrain. A woman with a stain? They remember that forever. The air in her small room felt thick, suffocating. She had to get out. The dawn was just a whisper of lavender and ash over the eastern hills as she stepped outside. The cold air was a shock, but a welcome one. It felt real. It felt clean. She walked to the garden, her basket in hand, seeking refuge in the familiar routine of her chores. She clipped rosemary and mint, the sharp, clean scents a temporary antidote to the sour taste of fear in her mouth. When she entered the kitchen, Rosa was already there, a pot of coffee just beginning to bubble on the stove. "Didn't hear you come down," Rosa said, her back to Iris, as she kneaded a ball of dough on a floured board. "I didn't sleep much." Rosa glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes taking in Iris's pale face and the dark circles under her eyes. "That man," she said, her voice low. "The one who came by yesterday. He a friend of yours?" Iris hesitated, the lie sticking in her throat. "Not anymore," she said, the words barely a whisper. Rosa turned back to her dough, punching it down with a sudden, vicious force. "You need me to run him off. You just say the word. I've got a cast-iron skillet heavy enough to change a man's mind about most things." A ghost of a smile touched Iris's lips, the first real warmth she'd felt since seeing Caleb's face. "I might just take you up on that, Rosa." They didn't say anything else. But when Rosa set the breakfast plates on the table, Iris saw there were 3 extra biscuits on her plate. It was a small thing, but in the silent language of the Hayes Ranch, it was everything. Later that morning, Colton found her near the barn, methodically checking the latch on the back gate, testing it again and again, as if the safety of the entire ranch depended on it. "He came here for something," he said. It wasn't a question. She kept her eyes on the latch, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold metal. She didn't answer. "You don't owe me an explanation, Iris," he said, his voice gentle. "But I saw your face when he said your name. I saw the way you looked at him." She finally let go of the gate and turned to face him. The truth felt like a stone in her throat, heavy and sharp. "He used to be my husband." Colton didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He just stood there, his arms loose at his sides, his gaze steady and patient, giving her the space to speak. The words started to come, hesitant at first, then faster, a torrent of memory she had held back for years. "I was 23 when we married," she said, her voice dry as dust. "He was charming, smart. He had so many plans. He was always talking about the future, about how we'd buy land and build something that mattered." She looked away, toward the distant hills. "He borrowed money, a lot of it. He used my name, forged my signature on the loans. He disappeared the same week the bank came knocking on my door." She took a shaky breath. "They tried to charge me with fraud. They said the signature was mine, that I was his accomplice. I spent a month in a county jail before the war ended, and things got so chaotic, the court just dismissed the case on a technicality. They didn't have the time or resources to pursue it." "You never told anyone," he said softly. She let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "No one believed me back then, Colton. A woman's word against a man's? Against a signed piece of paper? What makes you think they would believe me now? I believe you. The words were so simple, so direct. She looked at him then, really looked at him, not through the fog of her own fear and guilt, but straight into the calm, weathered face of a man who wasn't running from anything. A man who was offering her a bedrock of belief in a world that had always felt like quicksand. I didn't want you to find out this way, she whispered. I didn't ask you who you were before you came here, he said, taking a step closer. I care more about who you are now. But still, she couldn't relax. The fear was too deep, too old. Caleb isn't finished, she said. He didn't come here just to see me. He came to rattle my cage and it worked. But I'm not leaving. Good, Colton said, his voice firm. Because I'm not letting him push you out. A tense, fragile quiet settled over the ranch for the rest of the day. Iris threw herself into her work with a desperate energy, reorganizing the entire storeroom, oiling every squeaking hinge on the property, sanding down an old wooden bench that Rosa had long ago given up on. She worked until her muscles ached and her mind was blessedly blank. Near dusk, as she was washing the grime from her hands at the outdoor pump, Rosa came out of the house, her expression grim. She was holding a worn, slightly dirty envelope. This came for you, she said, her tone tight. A messenger from town just dropped it off, said it was urgent. Iris took the envelope, her hand trembling slightly. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Caleb's. Her chest tightened, a cold band of fear squeezing the air from her lungs. With numb fingers, she tore it open. The note inside was short and brutal, each word a carefully aimed blow. You want to keep your new name? You want to keep your new life? Meet me at the river bend, the one by the old sycamore, at sunset tomorrow. Come alone, or I start talking. I'll tell everyone in this dusty little town the story of Iris Morgan. There was no signature. None was needed. That night, Iris sat on the foot of her bed, the letter clutched in her hand. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor. She could run. She could pack her small bag and disappear into the darkness, just like she had done before. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But men like Caleb didn't bluff. He had waited years for this. He had tracked her all the way to this remote corner of the world. He wanted something, and if he didn't get it, he would burn her life to the ground just for the pleasure of watching it burn. She got up, her movements stiff and slow, and retrieved the other letter from beneath the floorboard. Her confession, the truth, inked in her own hand, every painful detail. She stood there in the quiet moonlight, holding the two letters. One was his lie. The other was her truth. Then she made a decision. She slipped on her coat, her face set in a grim, determined mask, and walked across the dark yard toward the main house. Colton was on the porch, reading a worn book by the light of a single oil lamp. He looked up as her boots sounded on the steps. She stopped in front of him and held out her confession. I need you to read this, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror that was churning inside her. He took the letter without hesitation, his eyes searching hers. Read it slowly, she said. The lines between his brows deepened as he read. The porch was silent, the only sound the rustle of the paper in his hands and the distant cry of a coyote. He read it once, then he read it again. When he finally looked up, his face was a mask of stone. But there was no judgment in his gaze. There was no revulsion. There was only a quiet, simmering anger and something fierce and protective burning just beneath the surface. He's blackmailing you, he said, his voice a low growl. She nodded, then handed him the second letter, Caleb's demand. He wants to meet me at the river bend tomorrow at sunset. Colton stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire porch. Then we'll be there. He said to come alone. He gave her a long, hard look. I'll be close enough that he won't see me, but I'll be there. She started to protest, to argue that this was her fight, her mess to clean up. But she stopped. She saw the look in his eyes. There was no point in arguing. He had already decided. "Are you sure about this, Iris?" he asked, his voice softening. "You don't have to face him." "Yes, I do," she said, and she was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I need to end this. I need to say the truth out loud, with my own voice this time. Not just write it down and hide it under a floorboard." He stepped closer, and for a moment, she thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he reached out and gently placed her confession back in her hand. "You don't owe anyone a confession," he said softly, "but you deserve to stop running." The air between them was charged, fragile and full of unspoken things. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. "I'll saddle the horses at first light," he said. Iris returned to her room and placed the letter on the windowsill. She didn't tear it up. Not yet. Because tomorrow she would face the ghost of Caleb Morgan. She would speak her own name, the real one, without shame. And whether it shattered everything she had built or changed nothing at all, it would be her truth. And that, at last, was something she could live with. The air at dawn was thick and heavy, hanging low over the ground in a shroud of fog. It smelled of damp earth, cottonwood trees, and the cold, silty water of the river. It was a morning for ghosts. Iris rode beside Colton, their horses moving in a spectral silence through the dense willows and brush that lined the trail. Her hands were clenched tight on the reins, her knuckles white, but her spine was straight, and her jaw was set. She had chosen this path. Every step was her own. "You're sure he'll show?" Colton asked, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. "He'll be there," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Men like Caleb feed on control. He thinks he still has it." They reached the clearing by the river bend. It was a secluded spot, half hidden from the main trail, dominated by a massive ancient sycamore whose branches leaned out over the churning water like gnarled arms. Iris dismounted first. She tied her horse's reins loosely to a low-hanging branch, then brushed the dust from her skirt with a steady hand. She took a deep breath, held it, and then exhaled slowly through her nose. Colton remained on his horse, pulling back into a thicket of mesquite just out of sight. "I'll be right here," he said. "Yell once if you need me." She didn't answer. She just gave a single sharp nod, her eyes fixed on the empty trail ahead. A minute passed, then another. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rush of the river and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, approaching from the north. Caleb arrived with a swaggering confidence that made her skin crawl. He was wearing a new jacket, cheap but flashy, and he tipped his hat to her, as if they were old sweethearts meeting for a picnic, as if time hadn't dragged her through hell and back since the last time he had darkened her life. "Iris," he said, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd actually come alone." "I didn't come here to play your games, Caleb," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the stones on the riverbank. "Say what you came here to say." He dismounted lazily, taking his time, dusting off his gloves, as if he had all the time in the world. "Oh, I didn't come here to talk. I came to offer you a deal, a partnership of sorts." "I'm not interested in any deals with you." "Oh, you will be," he said, his eyes glittering with a malevolent glee. "You will be, once you hear what I have." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up for her to see. "This," he said, "is a sworn statement. Testimony signed and notarized from one of my old contacts in Wichita. A man who will swear, under oath, that you were my willing partner, that you helped me forge the bank records, that you knew all about the loans from the very beginning." Her blood ran cold. "That's a lie." "Of course it's a lie," he laughed. "But they don't know that, do they? And I can be very, very convincing when I have a few names and dates to back me up. I talk loud enough in town, tell my sad story, and your new cowboy friend is going to start having second thoughts. Then we'll see how long this little romance of yours lasts." She didn't flinch, She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "You want money." He shrugged, a casual, dismissive gesture. "Not much. $1,000 would do it. Just a little something to help me get back on my feet." "I don't have $1,000. "Then I guess we both lose," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't think you want to lose what you've built here, Iris. Look at you. These people respect you now. You're somebody again." Her mouth twitched, not with fear, but with something else. Something colder, sharper. "I am somebody," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Not because of you, in spite of you," he scoffed. "You always did think too highly of yourself." "No," she said, meeting his gaze without a flicker of doubt. "I just stopped thinking you had the right to define me." His face darkened. He moved as if he was going to grab her arm, his hand hovering in the air for a tense, breathless moment before he let it drop. The mask of charm was gone, revealing the ugly, desperate man beneath. "I'll give you 1 day," he snarled. "1 day to get the money. Then I start talking, and I will burn this place to the ground around you." She didn't blink. She didn't even breathe. "Do it," she said. He paused, thrown off balance. "What?" "I said, do it." Her voice rose, ringing with a newfound power she didn't know she possessed. "Go on. Tell the whole town. Tell them everything. Because I've already written it all down myself. The truth. And I gave it to someone I trust. If you try to ruin me, Caleb, I swear to you, you will go down with me. We'll see who this town believes. The woman who stood up for one of their own, or the pathetic man who came crawling back to blackmail her just to stay afloat." His eyes, for the first time, showed a flicker of fear. "You don't have the guts." A real smile, sharp and fierce, touched her lips. "I had the guts to survive you," she said. "That's more than you can say for yourself." He cursed, a low, vicious sound under his breath. He turned and mounted his horse with clumsy, jerky movements, all his swagger gone. "This isn't over, Iris," he snapped, pulling hard on the reins. "It is for me," she said quietly. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, disappearing into the fog like the ghost he was, leaving only a cloud of dust and the stench of his own false bravado behind. Iris stood perfectly still until the sound of his hoofbeats faded completely into the rush of the river. Then, a shudder ran through her entire body, and she let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. Colton stepped out from the brush. He hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't interfered. He had trusted her to fight her own battle. He had heard every word. She looked at him, her heart pounding, unsure of what she would see in his face. Pity? Disgust? Doubt? He walked toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry you had to carry all of that alone for so long." "I carried it long enough," she whispered, turning to face the river. The fog was beginning to lift, the sun breaking through, revealing the smooth, steady bend of the water as it cut its way through the land. It was like a scar, familiar and permanent. It had been changed, but it was still there. Colton came and stood beside her. "What happens now?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She just watched the water flow. "I think," she said finally, "I'd like to stop running." He nodded once, a small, simple movement that held a world of understanding. "Then stay." A quiet, clean silence passed between them. Then he added, his voice so gentle it was almost a caress, "Iris Morgan or Iris Bell. It makes no difference to me." And at those words, something inside her chest that had been frozen solid for years finally broke loose. Not pain, not relief, but the sudden, fierce, breathtaking permission to just be herself again. That evening, as the last light of day faded from the sky, Rosa brought 2 steaming cups of coffee out to the porch and set them on the railing. She didn't ask where they had been. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "Jed's planning on fixing that old chicken coop tomorrow. Says it's a 2-person job." Iris looked from Rosa's knowing face toward the dark shape of the barn. "I'll be there at sunrise." "Figured you would," Rosa said with a small smile. She lingered for another moment, then without looking at Iris, she added, "If you ever need me to carry a letter into town for you, or burn one in the stove, you only have to ask." Iris smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Rosa, but I think I'll be writing new ones from now on." Later that night, she retrieved her folded confession from the windowsill. She sat by the lamplight and read the last line one more time. Then, without any ceremony or drama, she tore it in half, and then in half again. Not to hide from it, but because it was no longer the only story that defined her. She wasn't afraid of a name anymore. She had faced the worst of her past, and she was still standing. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the story of Iris Bell was just beginning. The days that followed the confrontation at the river felt different, lighter. Though nothing on the ranch had outwardly changed, the sun still climbed over the hills, the horses still demanded their morning feed, and the hens still scattered in a flurry of feathers every time Jed rattled their pen. For Iris, the world felt new. Something deep inside her had shifted, like a creek changing its course under the frozen ground of winter. The constant, low-grade fear that had been her companion for years was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady calm. She worked just as hard, but not with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun their demons. She worked because she wanted to, because her hands found joy in the mending, the sorting, the creating. When she smiled now, it wasn't a mask. It reached her eyes. Colton saw the change. He didn't speak of it, not directly, but there was a new softness in the way he looked at her, a certainty that replaced the cautious reserve in his eyes. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, had learned her darkest secret, and he hadn't turned away. He had stood with her, and she had begun to see him differently too, not just as a quiet, kind man, but as someone who carried his own wounds, his own ghosts, even if he never gave them a name. One morning, they were in the storage shed, sorting through barrels of winter feed, the air thick with the sweet, dusty smell of oats. "You ever think of staying?" Colton asked, his voice casual, though his hands had stilled on the lid of a barrel. "For good?" She paused, her hand resting on a rough burlap sack. "You mean, not just for the season?" He straightened up, wiping the dust from his hands onto his trousers, and met her eyes. His gaze was direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I mean making a place for yourself here. A real place. Not just working the land, but owning a piece of it." She searched his face, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. This wasn't a proposal of marriage, not in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental. It was an invitation to put down roots. It was the offer of a home. "I never thought I'd have that kind of choice again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Well," he said, a small, gentle smile touching his lips, "maybe now you do." That afternoon, their newfound peace was shattered. Rosa returned from a supply run in town, her face a thundercloud. She dropped a bundle of cloth onto the kitchen table with a thud. "Bickner's back," she announced, her voice grim. "And he's not just sniffing around the courthouse this time. He's been meeting with the land registrar." Colton, who had been cleaning a rifle at the table, looked up, his eyes instantly hardening. "What's he after now?" "The same thing he's always wanted, your west pasture. He's dredging up that old claim, saying your original title paperwork is missing signatures." Colton let out a grunt of disgust. "That claim's been settled in court 3 times. "That doesn't stop a snake like Bickner from stirring the pot," Rosa retorted. "And this time, he's got a new angle." Iris, who had been listening from the doorway, felt a familiar cold dread begin to creep back in. "What angle?" "He says he has a witness," Rosa said, her eyes meeting Iris's. "Someone who will swear on a Bible that the fence line was moved years ago, and that you've been illegally grazing your cattle on his land ever since. He's filing a formal lawsuit." Colton shook his head, his jaw tight. "That's a bald-faced lie." "Of course it is," Rosa agreed. But a lie told in a courtroom with a crooked judge in his pocket can do a lot of damage. It could tie you up for years, drain you dry. Colton looked at Iris, and in that silent glance, she knew exactly what he was thinking. And she knew what she had to do. She had never planned on setting foot in that courthouse again, but fate, it seemed, wasn't finished testing her resolve. The next day, Colton rode into town to meet with his lawyer. Iris stayed behind, unable to settle, pacing the length of the front porch like a caged animal. She couldn't prove Bickner was lying, not on her own. Her word against his witness. But then she remembered something. A memory from those first desperate days when she was living in the shadows, a ghost by the river. She remembered seeing men at night. Not the men who had moved the fence posts recently, but others, weeks before that. Strangers, pounding new survey stakes and hammering official-looking signs into the dirt under the cover of moonlight. At the time, she had assumed it was just some rancher fencing off a boundary line. She hadn't thought much of it. But she knew now. It had been Bickner's men. They weren't just moving a fence, they were methodically planting false evidence, staging a claim, creating a fraudulent history on the land itself. And she had watched them. She had been a nobody then, a drifter with no name and no voice. But now she had a name again, and she had a reason to use it. When Colton returned that evening, his face grim, she was waiting for him on the porch, her hat already in hand. "I want to testify," she said, before he even had a chance to dismount. He froze, his hand on the saddle horn. "Testify?" "I saw them," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I saw Bickner's men planting those survey markers weeks before the trial. They were faking the boundary line. I didn't realize what it meant then, but I do now." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw hesitation in his eyes. "Iris, I don't want you dragged through the mud again. You've already been through more than enough." "I know," she said, stepping closer to his horse. "But if I don't stand up now, what was the point of any of it? It's just another thing I'm letting fear take away from me. This isn't just your land anymore, Colton. It's my home, and I will not let that man take it." Colton swung down from his saddle. He came up the steps and took off his gloves, his movements slow and deliberate. He searched her face, and what he saw there seemed to settle something inside him. "If you testify," he said quietly, "you'll be doing it in a public court, under your real name." "I've made my peace with that name," she said. He smiled, a real full smile that lit up his entire face. "You're sure about this?" She smiled back. "You asked me if I ever thought of staying for good. I guess this is my answer." A long, quiet moment passed between them. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "We go together." 2 days later, the courthouse in Las Pedras was buzzing with the same whispers and curious stares as the dance hall. The old building still smelled of dry paper and stale justice. Bickner sat in the front row, looking smug and confident next to his lawyer, a slick man with oiled hair and a smirk that was too wide for his face. When Colton's lawyer called his surprise witness, a hush fell over the room. "The defense calls Iris Bell." Iris walked to the stand, her back straight, her steps quiet but sure. She took the oath, her hand steady on the worn Bible, and met the judge's eyes without a trace of fear. She told them everything. She told them about the night she had watched Bickner's men pull up the old fence posts. She described the man with the limp, the sound of the cracked lantern glass. Then, she told them about the other nights, weeks earlier, when she had watched them secretly planting the false survey markers, creating the very evidence they were now using in court. She gave them times, details, descriptions. Her memory was a steel trap, and her voice never wavered. When Bickner's lawyer stood up to cross-examine her, he came at her with a smug, cruel smile. "Miss Bell," he began, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Or should I say, Mrs. Morgan." A gasp went through the courtroom. "Is it not true, Mrs. Morgan, that you have a criminal past, that you were once arrested for fraud?" Iris looked not at the lawyer, but directly at the jury, at the faces of the ordinary men and women of the town. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "My name was once Iris Morgan. And yes, I was once married to a man named Caleb Morgan. And yes, there was an accusation of fraud made against me, an accusation for which I was arrested but never convicted." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But none of that," she said, her gaze sweeping over Bickner, "has anything to do with the fact that I watched this man's employees commit fraud on Mr. Hayes's land with my own 2 eyes." The courtroom murmured. The lawyer's smug expression faltered. He had thrown his best punch, and she hadn't even blinked. The judge, an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes, leaned forward. "Thank you, Miss Bell," he said, a note of deep respect in his voice. "That will be all." They won. The case was dismissed, this time with a stern warning to Bickner that any further attempts to litigate the matter would result in his own prosecution. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, Colton offered her his arm, just as he had at the dance. But this time, she took it not with hesitation and fear, but with a quiet, solid pride. The town knew her name now. They knew all of it, and this time, it was hers, on her own terms. Spring came to Las Pedras slowly that year, as if the earth itself was hesitant, still deciding whether it was safe to let its guard down and bloom. The wind, for the first time in months, lost its bitter edge, carrying the sweet scent of wet soil and the first hints of lilac. The grass on the hills, once a dull, brittle brown, began to turn the vibrant, impossible green of new life. It was the kind of season that made people start over, sometimes without even realizing they were doing it. For Iris Bell, starting over no longer felt like a desperate act of survival. It felt like a choice. The ranch had settled back into its peaceful rhythm. The shadow of Elijah Bickner had receded, his public humiliation too fresh for him to stir up any new trouble. And of Caleb Morgan, there was no word. He had vanished back into the ether from which he had come, a ghost defeated by the light. Iris was finally still. The frantic energy that had propelled her for so long had given way to a deep, quiet contentment. One morning, she stood by the kitchen window, watching Rosa knead a great mound of bread dough, her hands moving with a quick, practiced rhythm that was as soothing as a lullaby. Sunlight streamed through the clean glass, falling in warm stripes across the scrubbed wooden countertop. The warmth in the air felt different now. It wasn't borrowed. It felt like it belonged to her. "You keep staring at that dough like that, and I'll put you to work," Rosa said without looking up from her task. Iris smiled. "You know, I don't think I'd mind." Rosa chuckled, a low, warm sound. "You've changed, girl. I remember when you first came here. You barely ate enough to keep a bird alive." "I'm getting good at trying new things," Iris said. "So I've seen," Rosa replied, a knowing look in her eye. Outside, the barn door creaked open, and Colton emerged, a bucket of grain in one hand, his hat in the other. He looked different in the soft morning light. The hard, guarded lines around his eyes had softened. He looked as if he, too, had finally let go of a weight he had been carrying for too long. When he saw Iris watching him from the window, he gave her a small nod. She grabbed her shawl from a hook by the door and went out to meet him. They met halfway across the yard, in a patch of bright spring sunshine. "You said once that I could make a place for myself here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Did you mean it?" Colton tilted his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "You already have, Iris. You made it yourself." "Then I want to make it official," she said. He blinked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Official?" "Not with a piece of paper from the courthouse, not right away," she clarified. "Just with words, with staying, with us." He reached out and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. He carefully unfolded it, revealing a silver locket, simple and unadorned, hanging from a delicate chain. It was old, worn smooth with time, but it shone beautifully in the morning sun. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "She wore it through all the hard years, through the dust and the drought. She said it kept her centered, kept her heart in the right place." He held it out to her, nestled in the palm of his hand. Iris hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding of the weight of what he was offering. This was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a piece of his history, a piece of his heart. "Are you sure you want me to have this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "I want you to have everything that's mine to give," he said simply. She took the locket, its cool metal a solid, reassuring weight in her palm. Then she looked up at him and nodded. "I'm not promising that I can forget everything that came before," she said. "I wouldn't want you to," he replied. "It's part of what made you who you are." They didn't have a wedding in a church with stained glass windows and a pipe organ. Instead, they stood under the sprawling branches of the old cottonwood tree behind the barn, the place where the wind always seemed to move through the leaves like music. Jed found a clean jacket for the occasion. Rosa cried more than she would ever admit, and the judge who had overseen Colton's case came all the way from town, without even needing to be asked, to officiate. There were no flowers, no veil, no fancy dress. There was just a woman who had fought for and reclaimed her own name, and a man who had finally learned to trust someone with his heart again. When the simple vows were done, and Iris kissed Colton with the quiet, steady confidence of someone who no longer feared their own worth, the small crowd clapped. It wasn't a loud, boisterous applause, but a long, heartfelt one. It was the sound of people who understood what it meant to watch someone walk through fire and come out on the other side, whole. A week later, Iris sat on the back steps of the porch, a pen in her hand and a fresh sheet of paper in her lap. She had already rewritten the letter 3 times, not because the words were wrong, but because she wanted the feeling to be exactly right. "Dear Aunt Emmeline, I know I disappeared. I know I left without a word, without saying goodbye. I didn't know how to face you back then, after everything that happened with Caleb. But I want you to know that I am not ashamed anymore. I was hurt, yes, but I was never broken. I live on a ranch now, in a small town called Las Pedras. His name is Colton. He is a good, kind man, and he saw me, truly saw me, long before I was able to see myself again. If you ever find yourself heading west, there is a warm bed and a place at our table with your name on it. I would love to introduce you to the chickens. They are very loud. With all my love, Iris Bell, again." She sealed the envelope with a steady hand and gave it to Rosa, who was heading into town for supplies. That night, as a sky full of brilliant stars blanketed the valley, she walked out into the west pasture. She stood by the fence that had once been a battle line, a source of so much pain and conflict. It was just a fence now. The land on either side of it was just grass, quiet and open and free. Colton came and joined her, standing so close their shoulders brushed. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly. "Miss what?" "Running." She thought about it for a long moment, the cool night air on her face. "No," she said finally, "but I'll always remember what it taught me." He nodded, understanding completely. They stood there together, watching the stars come out one by one. Somewhere far away, in a dusty file drawer that no one ever opened, her old name still existed on a forgotten piece of paper. Her past hadn't been erased, but it no longer stood in front of her, blocking her path. It followed quietly behind her now, a shadow that had lost its power. And for the first time in years, Iris wasn't afraid to look forward, because she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the road ahead was finally hers to choose. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what story is waiting to be told just around the next bend in the river.